Good morning and welcome to the Subcommittee on Energy and Environment and the markup of the Assistance Quality and Affordability Act of 2010. This legislation, which I co-authored with Chairman Waxman, will reauthorize the Safe Drinking Water Act Revolving Fund for the first time since its creation in 1996. At this hearing, we heard from representatives from urban and rural water systems, as well as state administrators of the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, all of whom testified in support of the major policy changes in the bill. Stephen Estes Smagiasi from the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority traveled to Washington to testify in the midst of a crisis in Boston following a breach in a pipe that caused a water supply emergency that affected over 2 million residents, including a large portion of my district. As a result of this incident, public attention turned to our drinking water system infrastructure and to the need for increased federal funding that will help to ensure a safe drinking water supply for years to come. Although the pipe break in Boston could not have been anticipated because the pipe that broke was so new, the reality is that the country's drinking water infrastructure is rapidly aging. EPA estimates that over the next 20 years, water systems will need to invest nearly $335 billion on infrastructure improvements to ensure safe drinking water to our nation. The witness from Massachusetts lauded the emphasis that this bill places on future planning, ensuring that funding can be used for replacement and rehabilitation of aging facilities, a change that helps drinking water systems think and plan ahead. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Stephen Levy, who is the director of the Maine Rural Water Association, told us that the important new policy directions proposed in this bill would improve the current program by ensuring that SRF funds are directed to the neediest communities and that technical assistance is provided to assist these systems with meeting their Safe Drinking Water Act requirements. We have worked with the National Rural Water Association to include some additional provisions in the manager's amendment to address the special challenges that small and rural communities have in ensuring safe drinking water to their customers. The Association of State Drinking Water Administrators, which is responsible for implementing the State Revolving Fund, also supported the emphasis on future planning and prioritizing funding for disadvantaged communities and appreciated the extra credit that this bill gives to projects that emphasize energy and water conservation. At the hearing, we also heard testimony on language that will strengthen EPA's endocrine disruptor screening program by making it a more robust and transparent program that screens drinking water contaminants to identify the chemicals that may pose a public health concern. In response to concerns raised during the hearing and following a commitment to work with interested stakeholders, we have included provisions in the manager's amendment that clarify some of its provisions to make crystal clear the fact that we have not added new authority for EPA to regulate endocrine disruptors under the Safe Drinking Water Act or any other statute. I look forward to working with my colleagues. That completes my opening statement. Let me turn now and recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Access to clean and safe drinking water is an important issue that all of us must take seriously. Changes to the Safe Drinking Water Act's funding allocations and uses must be measured not just to what our suggested needs are, but also what we as Americans can afford. And as we heard at the hearing last week, the science indeed must match that policy. We would like to address these issues in a constructive way. We need to focus our attention on those items that help drinking water systems address immediate threats, comply with the law, and avoid the unfunded mandate issue that bedeviled states and municipalities and drove changes to the Safe Drinking Water Act in 1996. At a time when increasing debt is a major national and global issue, we need to be careful about overspending and overexpanding eligible uses of the Drinking Water State Fund. The legislation in front of us authorizes $14.7 billion over the next 5 years. This amount for only 5 years represents the entire amount appropriated by Congress for the Drinking Water State Loan Fund over the last 14 years. We plan on offering an amendment to address the funding issue in a responsible way. Finally, with regard to the doctrine disruption provisions in Section 16, should be focused based on good science and complement the ongoing public and private investments in that area. We will also address that today. Yield back my time.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for calling this markup and bringing this bill to us. I think this legislation is important. It will work to ensure that public water systems deliver safe, affordable drinking water to the American people while creating jobs and prioritizing financially sound investments in our water infrastructure. I'm pleased that you worked with the stakeholders. Across the board, they are supporting this bill. Rural and metropolitan water systems, state drinking water administrators, civil engineers, labor unions, water technology researchers, and environmental groups. They all see the urgency of needed investments in our water infrastructure and a focus on projects that make long-term sense. The Drinking Water State Revolving Fund has not been reauthorized since it was originally enacted in 1996. This AQUA law would reauthorize it and increase its authorization levels. I think it's important that we brought together the stakeholders and worked this bill through with them. I know that you worked with the Republican members and their staffs and gave them early drafts of the bill and welcomed their comments. I want to commend you and Chairman Rush, who worked on the enforcement provisions, and Representative Eshoo, who has worked hard to strengthen the definition of lead-free. I have a longer statement I'd like to put in the record, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Great. Chairman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the statements of the ranking member. Like the competes bill that's on the floor today for us, it has a lot of good information in it, but question the funding. I yield back my time.
Great. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, the chairman emeritus of the committee, Mr. Dingell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to support the legislation. I have a splendid opening statement, which I know everybody's going to want to read when I insert it in the record, and I ask unanimous consent to do so.
Without objection, so ordered. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A clean drinking water supply that is both safe and affordable is critical to the public health of our nation. However, there are many problems with the proposed legislation as it stands today. Particularly, it is important that we make sure that any legislation we pass is both workable and avoids creating duplication of existing efforts. I look forward to the markup, and I'm hopeful we can work today on amendments that fix the problems with this legislation. Also, as our unemployment rate hovers near 10%, I think it's important that this Congress start focusing on creating jobs in the private sector. While government jobs and government spending continue to grow exponentially, families and small businesses in our districts are cutting back. While this Congress refuses to pass a balanced budget or even to pass a basic budget, American families are having to tighten their belts and make tough decisions on how to keep their household budgets fiscally responsible and manageable. Rather than spending billions on bloated government spending and leaving the bill to our children and grandchildren rather than pursuing real legislation, they keep focusing. We see these bills like the cap-and-trade energy tax and other things that the liberals running this Congress continue to focus on instead of cutting taxes for middle-class families that would create jobs. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling today's markup. Community drinking water systems provide drinking water to more than 250 million Americans. Clean drinking water prevents disease, reducing sickness, healthcare costs, and absenteeism in the workforce. Additionally, domestic industries rely on clean water as a key input for processing, cooling, and product manufacturing, creating direct economic value nationwide. Toward that end, the Assistance, Quality, and Affordability Act would substantially change the National Drinking Water Program and provide greater protection and information to those served by public water systems. By advancing our ongoing efforts to improve the safety of our drinking water, this legislation will not only increase investments in our water infrastructure, but also create jobs. Specifically, it would increase assistance to states, water systems, and disadvantaged communities. The bill would also encourage better financial and environmental management of water systems, heighten EPA enforcement authority, reduce lead in drinking water, and strengthen the endocrine disruptor screening program. It is important to note that California has already enacted a law that will make new drinking water plumbing essentially lead-free. This legislation will help other states follow California's lead. I look forward to working with my colleagues on this measure and other initiatives that will help sustain the long-term viability of our water systems, create jobs, and address future drinking water safety challenges. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for scheduling this markup, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Great. Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The safe drinking water state revolving funds have been an important part of maintaining and updating our nation's infrastructure for nearly 15 years. I support the program and the assistance it provides communities who otherwise might struggle to keep their water supply flowing. However, there are provisions in the most recent reauthorization draft that are troubling. Extensions of Davis-Bacon prevailing wage provisions, adding further cost to construction projects are unnecessary. As we try to get ourselves out of this economic recession, we should be doing what it takes to lower cost for municipalities, not to create more hurdles for them. I know this committee has recently looked at endocrine disrupting chemicals, and as a doctor, I know how important it is to be vigilant in protecting the American public from truly dangerous chemicals. I will be taking a close look at this section, but let's be realistic. It needs to be based on science and not politics. Of course, as with many bills this committee has rushed through, the appropriation levels in this legislation should give us all pause. Over the next 5 years, this draft bill would authorize the same amount of money that has been spent in the last 13. This is a time when Congress should be tightening its belt, and we have this dramatic increase in spending. At last week's hearing, I expressed some optimism because we did follow regular order for the first time in many such markups. I have to say now that I have to temper that praise. What good is regular order? What good is holding a hearing to investigate how a piece of legislation will impact our communities if we mark up that legislation before the committee can receive full answers from the witnesses? The hearing record from last Thursday's hearing is still open. Written questions are still being submitted. We have not received the answers, let alone had a chance to evaluate those answers. I asked the witness from the EPA's Office of Groundwater why the Office of Water, of which her department was a significant part, has so many unresolved issues identified by the Environmental Protection Agency's own Inspector General. This bill grants her office, within the larger Office of Water, a number of new responsibilities. This committee should be waiting for answers as to why this department cannot fulfill its current obligations before granting any new ones. And despite pledges to work with Mr. Quill over his expressed concerns regarding the vagueness of the language in the endocrine disruptor portion of the bill, it is my understanding that no changes have been made to eliminate any confusion or concern over the language. What could have been legislation with broad support is turning once again into a rushed partisan bill. This committee can and should do better. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Melancon.
I waive my opening.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the markup today on the Assistance, Quality, and Affordability Act. The Drinking Water State Revolving Fund provides much-needed resource to our states and local communities to update and address any deficiencies in our public water systems. In Texas, this fund has been proved critical to maintaining the safe public water systems. I can't imagine any state in the union who's not in a problem with our water systems, again, because of the aging. For those who don't see this fund as a priority, I'd like to point out that in 2007, the EPA conducted a study that determined that $334 billion would be needed over the next 17 years for water systems that are eligible to tap the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. That's a huge number. Earlier this Congress, we took steps toward meeting the need by investing $2 billion in states through Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and the Recovery Act, and I support the investment in our infrastructure and appreciate the chairman making this a priority. excuse me, I also appreciate the chairman's work to strengthen the endocrine disruptor screening program by requiring the testing of chemicals in drinking water and outlining transparent procedures for testing and updating methods. Protecting our nation's drinking water supply from contaminants and microbiological diseases is important. Its importance to communities across the country. That's why I'm a co-sponsor of the Safe Drug Disposal Act of 2000, in line with my good friend and colleague, Representative Jay Inslee, who seeks to keep chemicals from prescription drugs, including endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs, out of our water supply. I also support the Safe Drinking Water for Healthy Communities Act. Last Congress set the timeline for EPA to set a national drinking water standard for perchloric, a known EDC. And I look forward to working through Congress for the health and safety of our water supplies, and I yield back my time.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Griffith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for calling this markup today to consider changes to the Safe Drinking Water Act. Safe drinking water is vital for health and welfare. Very important that we in Congress ensure proper funding and provide oversight to protect drinking water. At the same time, Congress must take care in crafting legislation to minimize unintended consequences, particularly economic consequences. With the current economy, I worry about the ability of the rural areas I represent to be able to serve customers and implement changes while not bankrupting their systems. We must find a way to balance this need with financial responsibility. Families are tightening their belts, and Americans have been working to spend less overall. It seems that we in Congress should follow that example and keep our spending in check as well. There is a town in my district that has suffered greatly in recent years. Several businesses have closed their doors, and now this town is burdened with water and sewer loans that were taken out under the premise that industry customers would be a large part of the repayment structure. Now that industry has moved on outside the U.S., they're making extremely tough choices just to keep afloat. I know that this is not the only example, and many of you have examples as well. But I bring this up to remind you of how vulnerable many of our small communities are at this time. As we move forward with changes to the Safe Drinking Water Act, we must remain mindful of economic realities and work to ensure that legislation does not place undue hardship on our communities, while balancing our need to control spending levels. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Baldwin. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Barrow. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you for holding this markup today on legislation to amend the Safe Drinking Water Act. Like all of us, I believe it's essential to ensure the quality of our public water supplies. Here in the United States, public water systems must meet extensive regulations, and water utility management has become a much more complex and professional endeavor. In 2007, the number of community water systems reporting no violations of drinking water standards was 89.5%, yet some issues and challenges remain despite this progress. It's imperative that we focus our attention on matters to help drinking water systems address immediate threats and follow laws already established. As we consider the bill before us today, we need to be sensitive to the rate bases of our communities and their ability to afford the mandates required in the legislation. In addition, we must ensure that Section 16, which describes a new endocrine disruption program, is founded solely on good science. And finally, we need to be extremely careful about spending and expanding eligible uses of the Drinking Water State Fund. The proposed authorization of $14.7 billion over the next 5 years is the entire amount appropriated by Congress for the Drinking Water State Loan Fund over the last 14 years. So as we mark up today, I hope we strike a delicate balance between our current fiscal situation and the legitimate needs of our water systems. And I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. All time for opening statements has been completed. The chair now calls up H.R. 5320, the Assistance, Quality, and Affordability Act of 2010. The clerk will report the title of the measure.
H.R. 5320, Section 1, short title, this act may be cited as the Assistance, Quality, and Affordability Act of 2010.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as having been read and open to amendment at any point. Chair hears no objection, so ordered. The chair now recognizes himself to offer a manager's amendment in the form of an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The file number is ANS 01. And the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5320, offered by Mr. Markey of Massachusetts.
Without objection, the manager's amendment will be considered as having been read, and the chair will continue to recognize himself to explain the amendment. This amendment keeps in place the main principles of H.R. 5320, which have been endorsed and supported by a number of groups, and for which we heard very favorable testimony at the hearing last week. These include an increase in drinking water project funding, a new emphasis to prioritize projects that support economic and environmental sustainability, stronger enforcement provisions, a mechanism to provide funding to the communities who need it most, and strengthening of EPA's endocrine disruptor screening program. Based on testimony we received at the hearing last week and subsequent discussions with stakeholders, the manager's amendment includes a few tweaks to improve the clarity and intent of the program. The first of these changes pertains to the technical assistance that is given out to nonprofit organizations to assist water systems in providing safe drinking water to their customers. The new language requires EPA to give greater weight to technical assistance applications from organizations that are qualified, effective, and that are offering the types of technical assistance that are preferred by the water systems who they will be helping. This change is supported by the National Rural Water Association, and has now also, which has now also endorsed the legislation. I have also included an extension to the date on which the provision to create a true definition of lead-free for household fixtures and pipes would take effect. That date has been changed from January 2012 to 36 months after the date of enactment in response to concerns raised by some manufacturers of these products that they might not have enough time to comply. The remaining changes apply to the endocrine disruptor screening program and are again a result of hearing testimony and input from interested parties. In response to concerns that the language may have the unintended effect of creating a new regulatory framework for endocrine disruptors, we have added a provision that explicitly states that nothing in the language gives EPA any new authority to regulate endocrine disruptors. This means that any criteria or regulation that apply under any other statute which require EPA to show that an endocrine disruptor poses an adverse health risk still apply and cannot be circumvented. I have also made other changes to the language in response to concerns raised by stakeholders that the language requires EPA to make regulatory determinations in the absence of information about what sort of health effect the chemicals cause. In short, it is now crystal clear that the endocrine disruptor screening program is just that, screening using sound science and not regulation. I yield back the balance of my time. Are there other members seeking recognition at this point? The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the manager's amendment, especially Section 2 on the rural water, what I would say the rural water provisions of technical assistance that did come up in the hearing. I want to echo Dr. Burgess's concern that the hearing record's still open and we're moving. I think that's a valid point that he raised, but I will circle back around saying that the hearing did provide us an opportunity to address this section. Also, the 36 months after enactment of this act, provisions on the fixtures on lead-free definition, I think that's important for manufacturers to be able to comply once this gets final movement. I think the manager's amendment is helpful. I'm still concerned that we may not have a great definition for endocrine disruptor, and I'm also concerned about endocrine disruptors that might be that may not be harmful but may be helpful for individuals, that they may get thrown in also. So, but all in all, I think the management amendments helped, and I'm supportive of it.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on the manager's amendment? The chair sees none. The vote then comes on. Okay, hold it. You took it back.
If I might just inquire, is this, if this amendment is adopted by voice, at that point, the manager's amendment is open to amendment.
That's
is that right?
Okay. Yes, right.
Okay. Thank you.
So the So we are now looking for members who wish to proffer amendments.
Do you have to not pass that first? No?
No.
Okay.
Okay. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. is recognized.
I have an amendment at the desk. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, number 14.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5320 offered by Mr. Griffith. Amend paragraph 1 of section 9 of the amendment to read as follows. 1, in paragraph 2A. In the first sentence, by striking up to 4% of the funds allotted to the state under this section.
I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman's amendment be considered as having been read, and that the gentleman be recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under existing law, a state can annually use up to 4% of the funds allotted to it under the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund to cover the reasonable cost of administering safe drinking water, including the recovery of reasonable costs expended to establish a state loan fund, and to provide technical assistance to public water systems within the state. In addition, the legislation strikes this provision and replaces it with language allowing a state to receive the greater of either 6% of all grant awards or an amount based on a formula involving the valuation of the state loan fund. In addition, the legislation strikes the requirement on the state for a one match for up to another 10% from the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund for the state to use to administer public water system supervision programs, technical assistance for source water protection programs, development and implementation of capacity development strategies, and operator certification programs. My amendment would strike the language in the bill and replace it with language allowing states to use 5% of the funds allotted to it under the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund to cover the reasonable cost of administering the programs, or a 1% increase. In addition, this amendment would restore the dollar-for-dollar match for the additional 10% that a state could use. The amendment recognizes that a state might need funding to avoid unfunded mandates from this bill, but curbs their increase. Further, it does away with complex formulas and instead relies on a simple number calculation like that in the existing law. In fact, as drafted, there is a complex formula set up, quote unquote, an amount that does not exceed the sum of the amount of any fees collected by the state for use in covering reasonable costs of administration of programs under this section, regardless of the source, and an amount equal to the greatest of $400,000, 1/5 of 1% of the current valuation of the state loan fund, or 6% of all grants awards to the state loan fund under this section for the fiscal year. Now, my question to council, how many attorneys do you think a town of 3,500 are going to need to hire to figure that one out?
I think one math teacher could do it.
Great. So we've got a math teacher on the payroll. Okay. It seems that that leaves it's good work. This is good work. This is making attorneys will never go out of style. At any rate, with families tightening their belts and Americans needing to spend less overall, we need to keep spending in check as well. This amendment removes the lottery-like provisions in the legislation and helps strike a balance between helping states and holding the line on spending. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Great. Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes himself in opposition to the amendment. This amendment will cut the funding for states to administer the state revolving fund program from 6% down to 5%. During last week's hearing, the drinking water administrator for the state of Maine said that the current set-aside level of 4%, quote, generally has not been adequate to finance the staff time and expenses needed to administer the drinking water state revolving fund. He even went on to say that states are using funds from other programs to supplement the amount they're getting from the SRF for administrative costs. We are asking more of the states in this bill. We're asking them to do more to identify and help disadvantaged communities, and we're asking them to change the way they prioritize and weight grant applications. That takes new money and new employees to do so. This isn't a pay raise. This is a cost of living increase that adjusts both for the current realities facing state budgets and the added responsibilities we are asking the states to take on in this legislation. I urge a no vote on the Griffith Amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, to speak in support of the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for that purpose.
Thank you. I want to appreciate my colleagues. I think he did a good job talking about the complexity. If we're going to be providing assistance as far as grants and low interest loans to help expand and improve water drinking facilities, that money ought to go to do just that. And I would expect even in the rural areas that they have the people that will be able to process this. They're processing requests right now. And so in a period of time of limited dollars, the last thing we want is more bureaucracy, and we want more money going to where it's needed, which is providing safe drinking water. So I appreciate the gentleman's amendment, and I ask for a yes vote.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on the Griffith Amendment? The chair sees none. The vote then comes on the Griffith Amendment. All those in favor signify by the sign of aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is defeated. Are there other amendments? Are there other members seeking recognition to make amendments? The gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Baldwin, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5320 offered by Ms. Baldwin of Wisconsin.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I don't intend to use the full 5 minutes, but among the concerns I have as we ensure a safe water supply is the presence of pharmaceuticals and other personal care products in our drinking water. In 2008, an Associated Press study found pharmaceuticals in the drinking water supplies of approximately 46 million Americans. A vast array of pharmaceuticals, including antibiotics, mood stabilizers, and hormones, were found. In the district that I represent, specifically in Dane County, Wisconsin, traces of acetaminophen and hormones have been found in some of the water systems. Little is known about these drugs and other personal care products, including their source, the effects they have on our health, environment, and drinking water, and how to prevent their presence in our drinking water. My amendment simply provides that EPA study these factors and report the results to the Congress. Nothing in this amendment is intended to make any presumptions or accusations. It simply allows us to acquire more information so we can be best informed and make a policy as appropriate in the future. Maintaining clean and safe drinking water is essential, and I urge my colleagues to support this study. And I yield back the remainder of my time.
Great. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on the Baldwin Amendment? The Chair will recognize himself briefly, and just to point out that in 2008, the Associated Press found that pharmaceutical residues were detected in the drinking water of 24 major metropolitan areas serving 41 million people. One of the cities in the AP report was Washington, D.C., whose drinking water had detectable levels of antibiotics, anti-inflammatory drugs, anticonvulsants, and mood-stabilizing drugs. That is the water which is sitting in front of each of you right now during this hearing. So if you need your mood stabilized, just have a nice little glass of water right now. Those drugs have already been provided inside of the drinking system of the city of Washington, D.C. So I think the gentlelady has made a very, very good point, and I would urge adoption of her amendment. Are there other members seeking recognition at this time?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Illinois.
And just in support of the amendment, just to say I want to thank her. As long as we use real science, remember there's been years that we've been telling people to throw their pharmaceuticals into the toilet. I mean, that's the way we have been doing it for decades. I think we're now learning that that's probably not the best method. Doing a research on this will be helpful if we use real science, and so we applaud the gentlewoman's amendment, and I support it.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on the Baldwin Amendment? The chair sees none. The vote then comes on the Baldwin Amendment. All those in favor signify by the sign of aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Are there other members seeking recognition at this time? The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and we appreciate your bringing up this legislation for our consideration, which I think is very important legislation. I have an amendment at the desk that I would like to bring up.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5320 offered by Mr. Whitfield. In Section 1457 of the Safe Drinking Water Act, proposed to be amended by Section 16 of
Move that the reading of the amendment be dispensed with.
Without objections, so ordered. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I'm actually going to end up withdrawing this amendment, but I want to raise the issue simply to have the opportunity as we move forward on this legislation to work with you and others to see if we can reach some sort of an agreement on this issue. It's rather technical in that it relates to the endocrine disruptor screening system over at EPA. And in this legislation, testing and screening are two separate methods that is used by EPA to determine issues about certain substances. And yet in this legislation, the definition for screening and testing are exactly the same. And we had testimony during the consideration of this legislation by various witnesses that the definition for screening and testing should be different because they are two separate types of processes to help EPA make decisions on some of these issues. And so this amendment would simply make a separate definition for testing and screening as opposed to in the legislation they have the same definition. So with that, unless someone would like to comment on it, I'd like to withdraw the amendment and just have the opportunity to work with you and your staff to look at it.
It would be more than welcome to do that. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Then I'll withdraw it then. Thank you.
The gentleman's made a unanimous consent request to withdraw his amendment at this time, preserving his prerogatives for the full committee without objection. So ordered. Are there other members seeking recognition at this time? Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
I'll be happy to yield to Mr. Griffith. I didn't see that his hand was raised. If he has an amendment, I'd yield to him.
Then the chair will recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Griffith.
Yes. The legislation before us, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, I jumped the gun there.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5320 offered by Mr. Griffith.
Okay, with the clerk, yeah, we thank the clerk for reporting the amendment.
In Section 1452M1 of the Safe Drinking Water Act, as proposed to be amended by Section 10 of the amendment, strike subparagraph A.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as having been read, and the chair will recognize the gentleman from Alabama to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The legislation before us authorizes $14.7 billion in funding for the drinking water revolving fund over the next 5 years, almost the entire amount of money that has been appropriated for this program since fiscal year 1997. When the drinking water state revolving fund was last authorized, Congress provided $9.6 billion over 10 years, including $1 billion per year in authorization from 95 to 2003. Section 10 authorizes $1.5 billion in 11, $2 billion in each of fiscal years 12 and 13, and $3.2 billion year 14, and $6 billion in 15. In addition, Section 10 of the legislation allows EPA to reserve $1 million each year from the Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Fund to pay for its own drinking water needs, quote-unquote, needs survey of states. This amendment would lower the amount of federal money authorized over the next 5 years and strike the provision that allows for the spending of $1 million per year to pay the cost of conducting needs surveys. The amendment uses President Obama's fiscal year 11 budget request, $1.287 billion, as the base amount, and then increases it 10% each year over the next 5 years. The bottom line is that the amendment would authorize $7.8 billion over 5 years, or a little less than half of what the legislation proposes. This approach makes more financial sense. As drafted, the fiscal year 2011 authorization would quadruple or increase by 400% the fiscal year 2015. Why would we need to quadruple the budget of this program in such a short amount of time? We can show some responsibility, some financial responsibility here while funding an important program. We cannot keep on spending the way we have been, and this is an opportunity to show some financial restraint. I urge the support of this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes himself in opposition to this amendment. The need for drinking water infrastructure improvements in our nation is tremendous. We heard testimony last week that aging infrastructure is the largest public health concern for drinking water utilities. That's because our infrastructure is failing faster than it is being replaced. According to the American Water Works Association, the oldest cast iron pipes dating to the late 1800s have an average life expectancy of about 120 years. Because of changing materials and manufacturing techniques, pipes laid in the 1920s have an average life expectancy of about 100 years. And pipes laid in the post-World War II boom can be expected to last about 75 years. That means that we are looking at the looming failure of a large portion of our pipes. The latest EPA needs survey estimates that it will cost $335 billion over the next 20 years to make infrastructure improvements that will ensure safe drinking water. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The residents of Boston learned just how disruptive and costly a major breach can be. Just a few weeks ago, the pipes cost much more to fix after they break. That is lesson number one. By delaying action, we dig ourselves deeper into a hole and leave a bigger problem for the next generation to deal with. Some might say that we can't afford to make these sorts of projects eligible for funding. In my view, we cannot afford to not do so. So I urge a no vote on the Griffith Amendment. I yield back the balance of my time. And I recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Texas, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this amendment goes to the crux of the the issue where our side is opposing this bill, and it's because of the cost. I once worked at the Office of Management and Budget, and I can remember usually the month of April was a surplus month for the federal budget. This last April, from a few weeks ago, we had an $80 billion deficit just for that month. We're likely to have, for a second year in a row, a deficit that will exceed $1.5 trillion. This is the first year since 1974 that the House is not likely to pass a budget, something that a lot of us on our side of the aisle would like to see a budget come up. But we recall the President's budget when he submitted it in early February, that he called for a freeze on non-defense discretionary funding pretty much across the board. This bill is a fairly dramatic increase on something we all care about, safe drinking water. It's hard to be against safe drinking water, sort of like it's hard to be against fraud and abuse. But at some point, we have to tighten our belts. We have to deal with this deficit that we have, and it starts in the subcommittees. The last couple weeks with bills on the House floor, you'll remember the green energy bill that went through. We had a cut on the House floor that reduced that spending rather dramatically. Last week on a math and science bill, a bill that, again, was going to increase spending to $85 billion. People said enough is enough. Where is the money coming from? And on a motion to recommit, that amendment passed again. In fact, the Democratic leadership is bringing that bill back to the House floor today. They're reducing the number of years of the authorization as well as the cost, really because of the outrage that both Republicans and Democrats voiced on the House floor last week with their votes. This bill is a dramatic increase over what we have spent over the past number of years, dating back to 1997. And this amendment, in essence, restores to what I think may be the President's level of a freeze, as it is non-defense spending, and something that I'm convinced every member on this side of the aisle, maybe some on your side of the aisle, will support as well, as it deals with the cost. That is what is our objection on this side, the dramatic increase in the authorization cost. And this Griffith Amendment, in fact, reduces that authorization to something that the President espoused when he submitted the budget as it related to the overall budget to get our fiscal house in order. And for those reasons, I am in strong support of this amendment and hope that it can be adopted. Yield back my time.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on the Griffith Amendment? The Chair recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Barton.
Excuse me. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was not here to give an opening statement, but had I been here, I would have said something similar to this, that the Republicans certainly support reauthorization of the Safe Water Drinking Act. We certainly support the continuation of the state revolving fund. We certainly support over time reducing the lead content in water and the lead content in pipes that transmit that water to our homes and workplaces. So the basic thrust of the legislation before us we support. Some things, though, we don't support, we being the minority of this subcommittee. We don't support a tripling of the state revolving fund from approximately $1 billion a year to over $3 billion a year on an average basis. Mr. Griffith's amendment strikes that funding increase and replaces it with a substantial increase. Under his proposal, the amendment that's before us today, we would spend almost $8 billion in the next 5 years, which would be an increase over the President's baseline of about $2.5 billion. That would be about a 50% increase over the 5-year period. That's a substantial increase. That's not penurious. It's not in any way uncaring about state and local governments and our local water districts' need for this state fund. As Mr. Upton just pointed out, We had a budget deficit in April of approximately $80 billion in a month that would normally we'd have a budget surplus of approximately that amount. Our budget deficit this year is pushing $1.5 trillion. For needs like this bill authorizes, Mr. Chairman, you and I both know that the demand will always exceed the ability to supply. We don't have enough money in the U.S. Treasury to right all the wrongs that need to be righted in our local water supplies. The federal government is not the end-all, be-all, Mr. Chairman. The federal government is a partner who helps in the most necessary cases, helps in the most dire straits. This bill is attempting to help, and I understand that and respect that, but I do not think that in an economy such as we have today, we triple the funding for this kind of a program. Now, we're going to call for a roll call vote on this, Mr. Chairman, and my guess is that the majority will vote against Mr. Griffith's amendment, and most of the minority, if not all of us, will vote for it, so it will be a party line vote, and your side, the majority, will prevail. We'll bring this up again at full committee, Mr. Chairman, if we don't win today, and we'll bring it up on the floor. We'll go to the Rules Committee, and we'll ask for amendments to be made in order on the floor. And if all those don't turn out positively, we'll put it in our motion to recommit. And as you know, we're pretty creative about the way we do motions to recommit. And we'll probably win that one. So why don't we eliminate all of that, and let's do it right now. If this is not acceptable, let's sit down with Mr. Upton and Mr. Waxman and Mr. Griffith and you and figure out what is. But again, we support the reauthorization of the Safe Water Drinking Act. This is not a straight reauthorization, and we are not going to abrogate our responsibility to the taxpayers of America and just throw money at problems, admittedly legitimate problems. We're going to have to tighten our belt, and we might as well start it right here. And it is not much of a belt tightening when you increase spending 50% over 5 years. So I would hope that we could accept Mr. Griffith's amendment and move forward. I'm under no illusions that that's going to happen, but hope does spring eternal, Mr. Chairman. So I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, I'm glad that the ranking member, my fellow Texan, did acknowledge what transpired last week, and it wasn't just a question of the spending limits, but really it was the motion to recommit and what has been a very convenient and often practiced on the other side of the aisle to place language in there that politically, members couldn't possibly not vote for a motion to recommit. It really isn't a good faith debate that has taken place on the floor, and I'm just glad that the other side finally acknowledged that what they consider is creative is really disingenuous. But no one ever talks about what's going on the floor. We can have a debate on levels of spending, but when the other side doesn't get its way, when they don't agree that it's a priority, you know what they're doing with the motions to recommit and the language they're placing. And when we reconsider today the Compete Act, we'll have some language regarding pornography and so on. I'm just wondering if members on the other side of the aisle would like to have that same flexibility today to add something of a similar nature that they would have in a motion to recommit in their amendments today. Now that would be just straight out acknowledging what the practice has been. You can't do it here in committee, they'll do it on the floor.
Would gentlemen yield?
Not at this time.
Okay.
And it is a question of priorities. We all are for reducing the deficit. We're all for reducing the national debt. During the Bush administration, when spending was being increased up to about 60%, I don't remember those voices that I hear today. And I don't recall those voices that I hear today that are strident in nature on the floor of the House every time that the Democrats have a proposal that addresses the crying needs of our communities. But today, I'm not sure that this is that difficult an issue for us because it's been identified as a priority and a requirement. When this committee established the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund in 1996, we wanted to make sure that we would have the best information available about the needs of our nation's drinking water systems. Therefore, we required that EPA conduct an assessment of the National Public Water System capital improvement needs every 4 years. This survey documents the 20-year capital investment needs of public water systems that are eligible to participate in the State Revolving Fund program. The needs survey is an essential undertaking for meeting the public's need for safe drinking water. For small systems, EPA collects the data by sending qualified, trained professionals to interview system personnel and document project needs. EPA staff and contractors prepare and distribute survey questionnaires to medium and large systems and complete an extensive review of the data received. The most recent needs survey was completed in 2007, and EPA found that our nation's drinking water system requires at least $334 billion in investment over the next 20 years. The AQUA Act rises to this need, seeking to increase the federal contribution for much-needed drinking water infrastructure. Unfortunately, this amendment seeks to shirk the federal responsibility to help our communities meet their drinking water needs. First, it slashes the authorization for funding by more than 2/3. Secondly, it cuts the funding in the legislation for EPA to conduct the needed surveys. In effect, this amendment says, if you don't like a patient's fever, just break the thermometer. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Great. The gentleman's time has expired. Other members seeking recognition? The gentleman from Illinois, the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
It doesn't matter.
Thank you.
Go
A
first.
gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to the ranking member.
I thank Mr. Pitts for yielding me. Let me point out, in response to my good friend from Texas, on his last point where we're slashing the President's baseline budget request for this year for this program is a little over $1.2 billion. We start out at 1.287, so we do a little bit better than the President. Then it goes up to 1.4, 1.5, 1.7, and 1.8 billion. It goes up 10% a year. Only in Washington, D.C. can the majority say that an increase of 10% a year is slashing. That is as creative a use of that term as I have ever heard. Number two, the gentleman responds to our creativity and motions to recommit. We play by the rules. The motion to recommit on the energy conservation bill included many substantive things, including Mr. Latta's amendment to require that we fund the increase, that it be deficit neutral. That was an amendment that he offered in committee, and the chairman of the full committee said he supported, and that he would work with the gentleman from Ohio. And there was some attempt to do that, but it was not successful. Had we been successful, that may have precluded the need to have a motion to recommit. But I want my friends on the majority to understand one thing. One, we play by the rules. Two, we will be as creative as we have to be to get our substance legitimately debated and voted on. If it takes unusual elements, as long as they're within the rules, we're going to use them. Now, we can do it at subcommittee, we can do it at full committee, we can do it in amendments to the Rules Committee, or we can do it in motions to recommit. But I make no apology, none, by playing by the rules that the majority puts in place to get our substantive issues heard, debated, and voted on, even when we lose, if it furthers the cause of public discussion, transparency, and ultimately accountability. Now, we may have a legitimate difference of public opinion. If the majority thinks they need to triple funding on the Safe Water Drinking Act, so be it. Be accountable for it, vote for it, and defend it. I understand that.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'll be happy to yield. Although he wouldn't yield to me, I will yield to him.
Well, I appreciate it. A Longhorn saying thank you to an Aggie publicly. But I will say this. The rules allow for many things. The law allows for many things. That does not make it right. you can bring the legislative process to a screeching halt.
Then vote against?
You can do all sorts of things to pervert process simply because you disagree. Now, I do believe that the majority has to respect the right of the minority, having been in the minority for a majority of the years that I've spent in this House.
And hopefully again.
However, it still takes a responsible use of that recognition by the minority. That's the difference. And if the other side wants to take pride in gridlock, in bringing everything to a screeching halt, so we do have to reconsider. The case in point today, these are identifiable needs of our communities, whether they're urban or rural. Now, I checked with the San Antonio water system, and I'm sure the other members have, and they agree that these are the needs. And what we're doing corresponds to what we believe the Senate will be doing in the investment that is necessary. Yes, it is spending, but it identifies a priority. And I believe that the majority is acting in a responsible manner.
Well, reclaiming Mr. Pitt's time, which I control, I respect my friend from San Antonio. I'm going to be in his fair city this weekend and spend some of my own hard-earned money on his economy. I'm going to go to his father's, the convention center named after your illustrious father, and will honor his name as I walk through the portals of that facility. So I am not anti anything that you say. I simply say we have a legitimate policy difference. We might as well settle it here because we're not going to let it go. And if, I would ask any of my friends on the majority, not just the distinguished gentleman from San Antonio, is there any spending issue that you don't want to increase spending in? Can you point to anything where you have agreed with us to spend less money or cut a program? Apparently, in the majority's mind, every program is so vital that it all has to be increased almost exponentially. And I would yield to my distinguished friend from San Antonio or any other of my distinguished friends on the majority to answer that question.
No, if you're yielding, of course there are areas that we need to cut, and those will be forthcoming. The problem is, we all know, it's the parochial interests of individual members. And we're all guilty of it, by the way. If it means a cut in your district, I assure you, or your state, we will all come together and say that's not where we're supposed to cut. However, you establish priorities. And sometimes, believe it or not, the national interest really does trump the parochial interests of individual members. That's what we need on both sides of the aisle. If we're really going to be listening to what our constituents are saying about the national debt and the deficits. But I would just say, let's have that fair debate, a good faith debate, identify what we believe are the priorities, and the fact that we are in the majority and have identified this as a priority, which is substantiated by the survey and the studies and what we hear from our constituents, then we move forward. All I'm saying is that sometimes process is important because it can poison the product that you end up with. And that's where we're heading in this Congress, time and time again, with those motions to recommit.
Well,
so I just say, well, let's just move forward. Let's have a vote on this. It may be a tough vote for some. It is not for me, because I know what the needs are of my community in the state of Texas. We have that disagreement. Let's make the investment on that which we have identified as a priority.
Well,
and I think safe drinking water is a priority for most Americans.
And reclaiming Mr. Pitt's time, we agree with you. And we think in our tight-fisted ways an increase of 50% over 5 years is not being derelict in our responsibility to the states and local governments. Keep in mind, this state revolving fund is something that was created in 1996 to assist and help the states. It was not created to supplement them, to supplant them. The majority of the money is still going to have to be provided by the local water control districts and the municipal districts and things of that sort. I think we've debated this, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your courtesy. I do continue to support the Griffith Amendment and would hope that we could get a majority vote on this. And with that, I yield back to Mr. Pitts.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. And we saw the gentleman from San Antonio praise an Aggie. We saw an Aggie say that he'd be willing to go to San Antonio to spend money at the Henry B. Gonzalez Convention Center. I think
and drink the water.
And drink the water. And so we're making great progress. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the debate's been vetted pretty well, and I just rise in support of the amendment, raising the same issues about spending. I think it's especially problematic now when there's a real risk that we will not have a budget on the floor. The budget is a direction of priorities, so if we may not even know what the priorities are. The budget's established the allocations to the appropriators, then they get deemed. There's no input from us to set those priorities. We're walking down a curious, terrible path. The one thing that this amendment does is addresses the $1 million each year to the EPA for their state water needs survey, and I think that's something that the states could do if we want. And I'm having an amendment drafted. I don't know if you'll allow it because of the timeliness to see if maybe we could just save $5 million in this authorization by addressing that small portion of this. And so I support the gentleman's amendment. I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. All time for the gentleman.
Just one thing.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I appreciate the amendment. I guess all of us could say maybe it's too much in the bill, 50% increase. We're only talking about an authorization. We're not actually going to spend this money. You and I know we could put sums as appropriation. We like this program, whatever the Appropriations Committee can do. And that's ultimately how we're going to spend money. This debate on whether we're being physically conservative and not allowing the authorization is almost as silly as 2 weeks ago when we were prohibiting the energy efficiency from being from someone who was who was a pornographer. And I said, well, what, you mean we're going to allow terrorists to caulk our windows? You know, my Republican colleagues forgot that provision in there. Maybe we'll see it when this bill comes up. But I do think we need an increase in the authorization for this fund because of the numbers around the country. And I know in our own state of Texas the problems we have. And so that's why it's important. So this is a great debate on whether we really are cutting spending, but we're only talking about authorization. We know
would the gentleman yield?
Be glad to.
400% increase is, if it's
Well,
400, why not 500? Why not 1,000?
Okay.
Why not even having any
Far be it for me to
authorization
be accused of being too conservative by my colleague from Illinois, but I think we're doing an authorization and saying this is what our priorities are, and safe and clean drinking water are important. Now, again, we still have to go back and get that money, and you know how that's almost near impossible in most cases, particularly where we're at today with our budget. But I think it sets a priority from our Energy and Commerce Committee to say we do know that safe drinking water is important. And but, Mr. Chairman, like I said, sometimes it's a joke on the floor. Maybe we ought to have substitute motions to recommit so we can make every heinous crime prohibited from caulking our windows or even having clean water in their homes. I yield back my time.
Expired. Are there any other members from Texas wishing to be recognized at this time? The gentleman from Alabama. Is it the gentleman from Alabama's amendment that we're dealing with right now?
Yes,
People have forgotten that. Thank you for seeking recognition to remind us of that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has been an interesting discussion, and basically it boils down to some principles. First of all, the gentleman from San Antonio who is concerned about priorities, it's very difficult to have any other priority other than overwhelming debt in America. When you are maxed out, your priority should be to reduce your debt. And then you become flexible and you can improve the standard of living and other things that you might need to do, such as national security. So priorities, when you're, as we say in the South, smelling water and in overwhelming debt, your priorities need to be the reduction of that debt. The other rationalization that somehow we can't afford not to, as the chairman spoke, none of those things are unique to this argument. Priorities and we can't afford not to will apply to every spending measure that Congress brings up. And so since all behavior can be rationalized, but numbers can't be, I believe that at some point in time, we'll begin to inch forward in reducing the debt. This is a good place to start. We're for this bill. We think it's a great bill. And we think that we can use some financial responsibility when we enact this bill to set a tone in America that we will no longer be beholden to foreign countries, not just for oil, but for our money and our debt. And so although it's not a whole lot of money, it is a principle here. But the principle that we're working on right now, we can't afford not to, and we're setting our priorities, is an interesting but vacuous argument as far as debt's concerned. Thank you.
Okay, gentlemen, this time has expired. All time for debate on this amendment has expired. We'll now vote on the Griffith Amendment. All those in favor signify by the sign of aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. The noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, then I
gentleman from
request a
Texas.
roll call vote.
Gentleman from Texas requests a roll call vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Markey?
Nope.
Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, no. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill votes no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle votes no. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Engel? Mr. Green? Ms. Green votes no. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, no. Ms. Harmon? Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, no. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin votes no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Waxman? Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Stearns? Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono-Mack? Ms. Bono-Mack votes aye. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Barton? Aye. Mr. Barton votes aye.
Point of order.
The gentleman from
Arizona.
Arizona is recognized to make his point of order.
My assumption is I'm still on the committee or the subcommittee.
I apologize. I may have jumped my eye down past you. I apologize. Mr. Shattuck.
Votes aye. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Mr. Shattuck votes aye. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch? No. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns votes aye. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes no.
Are there any other members seeking recognition to cast their vote? Chair sees none. The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeas were 12 and the nays were 18.
The amendment is defeated. Are there other members seeking recognition at this time? The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Melanson, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your holding this markup today and bringing this important legislation to the committee for consideration. I have an amendment before the committee that would make just a few small changes to the bill that would mean a lot to the rural and disadvantaged communities in Louisiana and around the country.
If the gentleman would cease just briefly,
yes,
so the clerk could report your amendment.
Thank you.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5320 offered by Mr. Melanson of Louisiana.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Louisiana is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. As I spoke, this is an amendment that I think will help all the small and rural disadvantaged communities, not only in my state but throughout the country. Unfortunately, infrastructure around the country is in serious need of maintenance, repair, in many cases replacement, and providing safe drinking water is not a public service on which I'm willing to compromise. I believe these amendments will be one more step towards helping these communities in need secure the funds necessary to build out these improvements. The first part of my amendment would increase the set-aside for disadvantaged communities from 4% to 6% of the available state funds. Because these communities are often in the direst need and have the least means to improve their water systems, we must make special care to recognize their hardships. My proposal is modest in nature, but signals to these communities that we do believe they deserve clean, safe water like everyone else. The second part of my amendment would simply change the amount of funds that a state may use out of its administrative monies to offer technical assistance to water systems. The state would be able to use 4% rather than 2% to provide this important help to the water systems. Oftentimes, there are simple solutions and improvements that can be made to a system that will yield great improvements to the community served. But without adequate technical assistance, we may lose out on these simple efficiencies and improvements. My amendment would give more flexibility to states to make sure we can take advantage of these low-cost but high-gain opportunities. And I'm proud to say that the National Rural Water Association supports this amendment, but I'm even more proud to say the Louisiana Rural Water Association supports this amendment. In Louisiana, 1,015 of the total 1,085 community water supplies serve populations less than 10,000. These communities will no doubt benefit from more attention and assistance through this legislation. I thank the chairman for the opportunity to offer this amendment.
The gentleman would yield?
Yes, sir, I will.
Yeah, this amendment will increase funds for the communities who need it the most and improves the underlying language. I encourage a yes vote on the Melanson amendment. The gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition on the Melanson amendment? Chair sees none. The vote then comes on the Melanson amendment. All those in favor signify by the sign of aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The Melanson amendment is adopted. Are there other members seeking recognition at this time? The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Shattuck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5320 offered by Mr. Shattuck. In Section 145711 of the Safe Drinking Water Act, as proposed to be amended by Section 16 of the amendment, strike that interferes or alters, and insert that causes an adverse effect on interfering with or altering.
So the amendment has been read, and the gentleman from Arizona is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a fairly simple and straightforward amendment. We discussed this issue at the hearing on this bill and in the discussion with several of the witnesses at the hearing. As has been noted here, this legislation is supported by both sides of the aisle and will pass. Certainly substantively, there's no disagreement with renewing the Safe Drinking Water Act. The issue, however, of endocrine systems and the impact upon, and the term endocrine disruption was discussed at the hearing. This amendment simply seeks to bring greater clarity to the definition of that term. The current statute or the current legislation says defines endocrine disruptor as anything that interferes or alters. This leaves open the door, interferes with or alters the endocrine system. This leaves open the door for anything which interferes or alters to the benefit of the individual as opposed to their detriment. It leaves the definition somewhat vague and assumes that you would have to regulate those things which impact the endocrine system by making the endocrine system actually better. And so this amendment is simply intended to bring a little clarity by simply saying that it still is limited to those things that interfere with or alter, but it limits it to those that cause an adverse effect by interfering or altering the endocrine system, or the definition of a term endocrine disruptor. I believe it adds clarity. Some may argue that it is implied in the current legislation or in the current draft legislation. In point of fact, I think if that's true, that's just a good reason to bring even greater clarity. I don't think it's our goal to regulate those endocrine disruptors which improve the endocrine system, but rather to regulate those which have some kind of a negative effect. That's the essence of the amendment, Mr. Chairman, and I would urge its support and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair recognizes himself in opposition to this amendment. The definition of endocrine disruptor used in this language is the same definition that is currently used by EPA. In fact, when EPA defined endocrine disruptor, it decided not to include the word adverse in its definition because the endocrine disruptor screening program is essentially a research program designed to identify and characterize those potentially harmful substances. EPA's memo announcing its definition went on to say that EPA recognizes that regulatory decision-making is generally based on adverse effects using legislatively mandated risk-based criteria. In its February 25th letter to the subcommittee, the American Chemistry Council also said that regulation of endocrine disruptors must be based on adverse effects. I agree with the American Chemistry Council, and I agree with the Environmental Protection Agency, and that is why nothing in the current language would remove the requirement in law that EPA has to show that endocrine disruptors have to cause an adverse health effect before regulating under the Safe Drinking Water Act. But what this amendment would do is define endocrine disruptors in a way that precludes the study or identification of health effects that might not require regulation, but would nevertheless be important advancements in science and public understanding. For example, some endocrine disruptors have been tied to decreased male fertility that may not qualify as adverse enough to require regulations under the Safe Drinking Water Act, but I think people would want to know that. Other endocrine disruptors have been linked to earlier onset of puberty. In and of itself, this also may not be cause for regulation, but starting puberty earlier has also been associated with higher levels of breast cancer in adulthood. In fact, I've heard that years ago, the very issue of adverse effect involved an assertion that it wasn't so bad that a particular pesticide caused test animals to develop extra glands. I don't know about you, but that sounds kind of bad to me, and I think it is something that we should take note of. I don't see why we wouldn't want to even know about some of the effects these substances could have on children. This amendment would prevent that research from even being done. We're debating this even as we learn from the Centers for Disease Control that 1 in 100 children born today will be diagnosed with autism by the time they reach 5 years of age. I just think we have to learn a lot more about this subject. It's clear that something is happening. It's not just reporting of disease. It's now actually something that is increasing, and I urge a no vote on the amendment of the gentleman from Arizona, and I yield back the balance of my time. Are there other members seeking recognition? The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the Shadegg amendment. One of the troublesome things about this reauthorization bill is it's going beyond reauthorization, and it's becoming a social policy bill.
Just find out where it fits in the bill.
I'm not sure that you need anything at all in a reauthorization bill with regards to endocrine disruptors. But I do yield to the discretion of the majority that if they feel it's an issue that's worthy of inclusion, I'm willing to take their view on that, although with some reservations. But one thing that I thought we could agree on is that what Mr. Shadegg is doing here is just saying that things can interfere or alter that are not adverse. If something interferes or alters and is positive, it shouldn't be a problem. If it interferes or alters and it's neutral, it shouldn't be a problem. If it interferes or alters and has no effect at all, it shouldn't be a problem.
Endocrine disruption.
If you believe that endocrine disruption has negative consequences, then you should also accept that you only want to study those things and try to prevent those things that have an adverse effect. And that's what Mr. Shadegg is saying. And to oppose this opens up the bill to what my friend Chairman Dingell would say, a mischievous result. Because you basically give a blank check to the people doing the study to, or at least conceivably could, I don't want to go too far in that statement, give those that are doing these studies to go very, very far afield of anything at all that would have negative consequences for our public drinking supplies. So I really thought that Mr. Shadegg's amendment would be one that would be accepted unanimously, and I'm somewhat surprised that the chairman is opposing it. So I do rise in support of it and hope that it would be accepted.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
I simply want to get into the record the fact that various depositions have been circulated by the EPA's Endocrine Disruption Screening and Testing Advisory Council beginning in 1998, but in the very first definition, and I believe in every other definition which the EPA has used, they have used the words as follows, quote, causes adverse effects at the level of the organism, its progeny, populations, or subpopulations of organisms. Each of the definitions used by the EPA has contained that language, to my knowledge, to this point in time, and I believe what we're simply trying to do is to reflect in this definition in statute what the EPA has already acknowledged, and I would again urge the adoption of the amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition? Chair sees none. The vote then comes on the Shadegg amendment. All those in favor signify by the sign of aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. The noes have it.
That I request a recorded vote.
The gentleman requests a recorded vote.
Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, no. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee, no. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, no. Ms. Melanson? Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Dingell? Mr. Dingell votes no. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Green? Mr. Green votes no. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, no. Ms. Harmon? Ms. Harmon, no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, no. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Waxman? Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bonomack? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes no.
Other members seeking?
Ms. Bonomack? Ms. Bonomack votes aye.
Are there any
Mr.
other members?
Waxman? Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes no.
Are there other members seeking recognition? The chair will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeas were 10 and the nays were 21.
Wait, the amendment is defeated. Are there other members seeking recognition? The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
I have an amendment at the desk dealing with Davis-Bacon.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5320 offered by Mr. Barton.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sure the members are going to hang on every word I say, and my eloquence will sway a positive result. I'm absolutely committed and hopeful of that. We all know what Davis-Bacon is. It's an act that was, I think, passed initially back in the 1930s to require construction contracts that are federal contracts, our big public work projects such as Hoover Dam and the Tennessee Valley Authority and things of that sort, that there be a prevailing wage study conducted and that the prevailing wage in that area be paid to workers who worked for that federal project. I understand the causes that led to that legislation, and I certainly support those that are very active with the labor union movement to be supportive of such legislation. So it is with respect that I offer this amendment. This bill before us expands Davis-Bacon. It says that even if it's not a federal project, if some federal funds go into the project, the direct contractor and apparently even the indirect contractors have to pay this locally prevailing wage, even though it may not in its entirety be a federally funded program. In my opinion, Mr. Chairman, this takes us into new ground that Davis-Bacon was not intended to. One could argue it is beyond the scope of this committee, since we are not the Public Works Committee. But since I am an institutionalist for the Energy and Commerce Committee, I would never say, Mr. Chairman, that anything is beyond the scope of this committee or this subcommittee. So I won't make that argument, but some could make that argument. I just feel like that even with all the good things that the proponents of Davis-Bacon highlight, again, with the federal deficits running such as they are, I don't think anybody who supports Davis-Bacon says it saves money. It normally requires a higher wage to be paid, which does cost more money for these projects. And to take Davis-Bacon and now mandate that it be applied beyond the original intent, I think is an expansion that is not appropriate at this point in time. So I would hopefully respect and request that we support the Barton Amendment and strike the Davis-Bacon provision from the pending bill.
Gentleman's time is
yield back.
Gentleman yield back the balance of his time. The chair recognizes himself in opposition to the amendment. The Davis-Bacon Act requires that those working on federal construction contracts or federally assisted contracts in excess of $2,000 be paid prevailing wages, ensuring that the jobs created with federal funds are good jobs and that workers are protected. We are hearing that this language would present an economic hardship for those who seek to use these funds and that we should not move forward with them, especially in these economic times. Well, the Davis-Bacon Act was enacted in 1931 and signed by Herbert Hoover in the middle of the Great Depression to protect workers against having to accept unfair wage cuts when federal funds were used. In the Recovery Act and in this year's appropriations bill, Congress included the very same requirement for the very same reason. Times are hard, and it is the workers who most need our protection. As it turned out, the Recovery Act funds for drinking water infrastructure were all obligated within a year, demonstrating both the great need for the funds and the ability of the states to comply with these provisions. Although times are tough, they're not as tough as they were in the Great Depression, when 1 in 4 Americans were unemployed. Yet in 1931, Congress and President Hoover decided that these protections were important because our workers are important. I agree with that, and I believe they are still just as important today. I urge a no vote on the Barton Amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time. Are there other members seeking recognition on the Barton Amendment? The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your observation on the history of Davis-Bacon is a good one. It is interesting to note that this amendment was not only signed by a good Republican president, but it was passed with the votes and support of a large group of Republicans in the Congress of the United States. And one of the complaints that triggered the adoption of Davis-Bacon was the fact that unscrupulous contractors were using the Depression and other circumstances to enable them to hire a bunch of relatively incompetent people at incredibly low wages to come in and take over government contracts in different parts of the country. And it was in part a response to the concerns that the people had about people coming in to break the wage scales and to hurt the communities by bringing in a group of people who would work at wages that would depress local wages everywhere in that community. And this was a serious matter, and so viewed by the Congress, because it was happening all over the country. It is now viewed as being a matter that benefits organized labor. The bill originally is done, and as it is enunciated today, doesn't mention organized labor, and it doesn't deal with labor rates at all. Labor rates are fixed in union shops by contracts between the employer and the union. And the concern today is as much as it was then. The test is not, are these union wages, or are they fixed by consultation with the unions at all? They're simply fixed on a statistical basis which establishes in a fair and open process the wage scales of the people in the area. And the purpose of Davis-Bacon is to see to it that those wage scales are not broken and that the communities don't have the kind of trouble economically and politically that would occur if this kind of practice were to be permitted to continue.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
I'll be glad to yield.
Well, I thank my distinguished friend from Michigan. Does the gentleman concede that the act of conducting the prevailing wage survey has the effect of setting the survey wage that has to be paid at the prevailing negotiated union contract wage?
No.
You do
because not, and the gentleman raises a good point, and I want to express my affection for the gentleman from Texas.
We've both established we are greatly affectionate of each other, so that's
and having done so, I will proceed to affectionately and
lambast.
respectfully differ with him.
As is to be expected.
The harsh fact of the matter is that this has nothing to do with wage scales. It is applied in areas which have strong unions and in areas which have no unions, and very little union influence on the economics or the wages of the area. What it does, it just simply says that you're not going to have a lot of rascals coming in, breaking the wage scales, causing disruption of the wage scales in the community, hurting contractors. And one of the interesting things about this legislation was it occurred in good part because the contractors in the different communities and the different businesses that were adversely impacted by this process and these practices protested and objected. It is interesting to note that at the time this legislation was passed, labor was really a very weak institution in the country. And so they weren't able to tie this to wage scales. And I don't even remember reading anything that they tried to do this. This was just an attempt to stop a bunch of outlaw contractors from coming in, profiting from an intolerable situation of economic downturn in the country at that time, to the hurt of communities, to the hurt of workers, and to the hurt of contractors who would provide local employment to the people who in fact needed it, and on contracts which served the broad public interest and which were negotiated solely according to local wage scales. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank my good friend from Texas.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to ask counsel a couple of questions in reference to the bill and the Barton Amendment, if I could. Florida has a right to work law. It's a right to work state. So when you go from Miami up to Jacksonville, the prevailing wage, I assume, would change. So the first question here is, as a general question, the way the bill is set now, would the state, when they go to prevailing wage, is there a prevailing wage set by the Department of Labor for Florida, which is different than New York? Question for the council. Just move the mic a little closer. Yeah, go ahead. Thanks.
Section 3 of the AQUA Act says that this section would require workers be paid at wages at a rate of not less than the wages prevailing for the same type of work on similar construction in the immediate locality as determined by the Secretary of Labor in accordance with Subchapter 4 of Chapter 31 of Title 40 United States Code.
Okay, so let's say you're in a my hometown of Ocala, where employment is about 15.5%. A lot of contractors will work for a lot less money than they would when there was no unemployment was only 3%, which was 2 or 3 years ago. So the state wants to award a contract in my hometown of Ocala where there's so many contractors that want to work. So do they use a prevailing wage from New York City or Arizona or Miami or Jacksonville? Where do they get their prevailing wage?
The language is limited to the locality in which the contract will be carried out.
Which means that the Department of Labor in Washington, D.C. is going to establish what the prevailing wage is in Ocala. They're going to determine it.
It's currently done county by county.
So they'll go to my hometown of Marion County and they'll say, so the state will go to the Department of Labor in Washington, D.C. and say to the bureaucracy up there, what is the prevailing wage in Marion County? And then that will dictate the bottom at which people could offer a contract. Is that correct? I'm just trying to understand how it's going to work.
If you look at the beginning of the section requires the EPA administrator to take such action as the administrator determines to be necessary to ensure that prevailing wages are paid. So the actual mechanics of it could be determined by the administrator.
In Washington.
Of the Environmental Protection Agency.
Would the gentleman yield for
Yeah, I'd be glad to yield.
clarification? Using the gentleman's explanation in his hometown, if there is a union contractor who has done work in the past in his hometown and has an established negotiated wage rate that is higher than the local prevailing non-union rate, but he does the union contract it's a published established rate, and work has been done in the past but is not currently being done, is that not included in the prevailing wage survey that's done?
Nothing in this language would change the methodology used by the Department of Labor to calculate prevailing
Which means
wages.
it would be included. And so even in a county with a 15% unemployment rate, the fact that there is an established union negotiated wage rate, even though that is not being used, is included in the survey because it has been in the past, and it talks about wages prevailing for the same type of work on similar construction. So it has, Davis-Bacon has the effect of raising the floor, raising the amount that has to be paid. And that may not be a bad thing. I'm not saying that's automatically a bad thing, but it is a fact that if this language is included, you are now not only requiring it be used for direct federal contracts, it has to be used for contracts that are state and local contracts because they receive some federal funding from this revolving fund.
Reclaiming my time before, the other point I want to make is this prevailing wage was established well before the economy tanked. So the question is, how current is this prevailing wage? Is it based upon month to month, or is this prevailing wage established 2 years ago? In your estimation, Council, when was this prevailing wage established? How up to date is it?
I don't have information in front of me about
Okay,
how
that's what I
often
thought.
it's
Well, I'll
reevaluated.
just conclude, Mr. Chairman, by saying the 2 points I'm trying to make is this prevailing wage is an artificial. With so many contractors looking for work, the state and the federal government could save a lot of money because a lot of these people will want work and they'll offer at a much, much lower rate. And the second thing is this prevailing wage, I think, is artificially high and does not reflect the economy today. So maybe down the line, Mr. Chairman, we should have a discussion of, if you're going to continue to include Davis-Bacon Act in all your bills, we should have established understanding, is that prevailing wage been established recently, or is that reflected 2 years ago, which is much more higher than it would be today? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition? The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief. I just wanted to respond by saying, I mean, when I hear what some of my colleagues on the other side are saying, I mean, they seem to be suggesting the very problem that we're trying to deal with here. In other words, as Mr. Dingle said, and I'll tell you that this is happening in my district, is that, you know, you have the problem now because of the recession where people come in who are not, you know, qualified to do this work and want to do it at a much less price. And as a consequence, it's shoddy work. You know, we're talking about the type of work under this bill that's very specialized. And my experience is that when times are tough, you get people that want to come in who are not qualified, who undercut essentially the prevailing wage. And that's exactly what we're trying to prevent. That's why this was done, as Mr. Dingle said, during the time of the Depression, because there are these outfits out there that are not qualified, you know, just try to take advantage of the situation, if you will, because of the recession to come in. My other experience is that right now, because of the recession, it is in fact the case that many times union contractors actually have reduced prices because they want the work. So I think that all we're trying to do here is prevent, you know, exploitation and having work that oftentimes, you know, if it's done not properly, has to be done again at even more expense to the taxpayer. So I think this is particularly important right now, and I kind of, you know, I think it's just a question of disagreeing about what we're trying to achieve here. We're trying to achieve quality work at a decent wage and not have workers exploited.
Will the gentleman yield? Will the gentleman yield?
Sure, I would yield.
The gentleman from New Jersey, wouldn't you agree, though, that by making artificially increased labor costs with a weak economy, then the money that's available for the state and the federal government to use doesn't go as far? Wouldn't you agree with that?
No, because I think that what often happens when you undercut the prevailing wage is you end up with shoddy work that has to be redone. We had this, for example, I don't represent the area anymore, but we had this a few years ago where there was a veterans clinic, and it was done through a lease-back agreement. So it wasn't actually, you know, somehow they got around the prevailing wage because it wasn't being built and contracted directly by the federal government with some kind of a lease-back, and they managed to get out of the prevailing wage because of it. And all the electrical work was so bad that they had to literally dismantle a part of the building and do it all again with union work, union contractors, and it cost the federal government twice as much money.
Well, another question then, would the gentleman agree, though, that just prevailing wage does not guarantee quality work?
Well, I think it helps, because what it means is that you're not getting these people, you know, that are fly-by-night that haven't gone through an apprentice program or haven't got the experience doing the work. And you know, usually the better work.
In New York's in the tunnel in Boston, you know, that tunnel was put together with prevailing wages, and as you know, the overrun was 5 times what they estimated. I mean, it can go right through down the line in some of the projects in the Northeast where the Davis-Bacon Act was used. It did not qualify, did not show quality work, and as you know, that's true. So
well,
the prevailing wages does not indicate that you have quality work.
Well, that's not my experience. It's my experience just the opposite, gentlemen. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The question will now come on the Barton Amendment. All those in favor signify by the sign of aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. The noes have it.
I ask for a roll call vote.
The gentleman from Texas has requested a roll call. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Markey?
Nope.
Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle votes no. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill votes no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle votes no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. No. Mr. Green votes no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, no. Mr. Hall. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns votes aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono-Mack. Ms. Bono-Mack votes aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee votes no.
Are there any other members seeking recognition?
Mr. Hall. Not recorded, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hall votes aye.
The clerk, gentleman from Illinois. How is the gentleman from Illinois recorded?
Not recorded, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Shimkus, no, I'm sorry, Mr. Shimkus votes no. Okay.
Why did you let him vote, Mr. Chairman? He was late.
You're right. You're right. I don't know why I did.
Actually, he's within the rules. He came into the room, so we have to let him vote.
So the clerk will report the vote. Okay. No one more. How was the gentleman from Kentucky recorded?
Not recorded, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Whitfield votes aye.
The clerk will record the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeas were 11 and the nays were 23.
Great. The amendment is defeated. Are there other members seeking recognition? The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. AQUA 04.
Okay. The clerk will distribute the amendment and report it to the subcommittee, please.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5320 offered by Mr. Burgess. In Section 1457 of the Safe Drinking Water Act is
without
proposed
objection, the amendment will be considered as having been read, and the gentleman from Texas will be recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The aforementioned section, there are various terms that are used. Terms like scientific information, scientifically relevant information, science-based criteria, and weight of the scientific evidence. But the section does not define those terms in any meaningful way and leaves them open to various interpretations. This concerns me, and it should concern everyone on this committee who wants to avoid unintended consequences from this bill. Since another part of the Safe Drinking Water Act contains language that governs the Environmental Protection Agency's regulatory decisions involving science, it makes sense that we should have legislative language governing the appropriate use of high-quality science as it relates to the endocrine disruption screening program. This amendment is based on testimony that we received last week and requires relevant and valid science guide prioritization and identification of endocrine disruptors and guidance on updating protocols, as well as revisions for testing and the determination of whether a substance is suspected of being an endocrine disruptor. The amendment defines scientific information to be verifiable measurements with sufficiently small error rates, well-controlled measurements whose interpretation is not confounded by extraneous influences, and results that are repeatable by independent scientists. The amendment also defines relevant to mean pertinent to the determination at hand. It is essential that if regulatory determinations or other expensive administrative orders are going to be made in the name of public health, that is the best and highest quality, that valid science be used. On February 25, our subcommittee heard testimony concerning the importance of using basic scientific principles in the endocrine screening program. Those principles were defined in the amendment and include scientific studies must measure what they claim to have measured within a known margin of error. Measurements and observations must not be confounded by extraneous factors and influences known to corrupt their accuracy and precision, and measurements and observations must be able to be replicated in independent hands. Of note, at the Earth Day 2010 hearing by the Health Subcommittee, the heads of the National Institute for Environmental Health Science, the CDC's National Center for Environmental Health, agreed that, quote, good science, close quote, includes these principles, and that the regulatory policy in the United States, to the extent that it is going to rely on scientific research, should, at a minimum, make these criteria the cornerstone of our policy making. This amendment puts into legislative text the words spoken by the heads of these two environmental research agencies that are supposed to protect the public health from environmental hazards. We should not have lower quality, unsubstantiated, or sloppy scientific work drive decision-making on key issues, particularly if this information or its evaluation fails to consider all of the data or misstates the relevance of data upon which it relies. We should ensure that high-quality science, which adheres to basic scientific tenets, is part of the program to ensure that we get the best information on which to base these decisions. Again, this is important if we want to actually do the good work that we intend to do and avoid the pitfalls of unintended consequences. This was brought out in testimony by one of the witnesses last week at our hearing, and again, it is unfortunate that we have not allowed sufficient time between the hearing and the markup in the subcommittee to allow the written testimony of the witnesses to come back before us, but I think the amendment speaks for itself and stands on its own merit, and I urge other members to support the amendment, and will yield back the balance of my time.
Okay, the gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes himself in opposition. What the Burgess Amendment is seeking to do is to add language that would limit the data that the EPA can use to evaluate potential endocrine disruptors to studies preferred by the chemical industry, shutting out university scientists who may be conducting important, relevant, and peer-reviewed work. I mean, the endocrine system is really the computer system of the body. And in the same way that viruses can get into computers and completely change the way in which those computers operate, if chemicals are affecting the endocrine system, the computer system, especially of children in their early years, then this computer system of the body can be modified by chemicals that are in the water that are impacting on the way that child is, in fact, developing. So in the months that I spent developing the language, I heard from both industry and environmental stakeholders that EPA needed to consider science conducted by others that was relevant to the test that it was ordering. This would save industry from conducting costly, time-consuming, and duplicative tests and get the results that we need to make decisions about limiting exposure more quickly. So in this language, I have included a requirement that EPA develop guidance through a public process that would specify the sort of scientific data that it would consider as being equivalent under the testing program. Industry will have every opportunity to participate in this process, but we shouldn't be short-circuiting EPA's authority by pretending that Congress knows what science it should or should not use. Chronic diseases and disabilities have reached epidemic proportions in the United States, affecting more than 100 million men, women, and children, more than 1/3 of our population. Asthma, autism, birth defects, cancers, developmental disabilities, diabetes, Parkinson's disease, other diseases and disabilities are causing increased suffering and concern. CDC says 1 in 100 children in America are now born with autism. And while many point to increased detection, the reality is that more sensitive equipment cannot account for this. Since the industrialized era, cancer, obesity, diabetes, birth defects have been consistently on the rise. It is clear that in our environment there is a role that is being played in creating disease, and the environment and the things that we put into the environment are affecting us. Since World War II, more than 80,000 synthetic chemicals have been registered for use in the United States. Another 2,000 are added each year. Few are adequately treated for their potential impacts. Scientific evidence increasingly indicates a relationship between a range of environmental factors and these diseases and conditions. One important contributor may be increased exposure to a wide array of chemical substances that are used in modern industrial society, including diverse synthetic chemicals, compounds, metals, and related elements, as well as other pollutants in food, water, and air. These pollutants have become widespread in all of our society. By tying the EPA's hands, we would hinder our ability to connect the dots between exposure to these chemicals and the diseases and disorders that they may cause. I do not think that we should be the scientists. I think we should hand this over to the scientists. Congressional expert is an oxymoron. We're not experts compared to real experts. You know, it's an oxymoron, like Salt Lake City nightlife. There is no such thing as a scientific, and we're so I urge a no vote on the Burgess Amendment, and I yield back to
the gentleman. Yield,
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I seek recognition in support of the Burgess Amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for that purpose.
And at some point in time, I will yield to my friend from Texas. I just want to point out, the author of this amendment is a medically trained doctor, certified by the state of Texas, certified by many national organizations. The last thing in the world he would attempt to try to do is tie the hands of the Environmental Protection Agency. It's only a 3-page amendment. I would encourage members to read it. All it says is where they're talking about science in the language of the bill, to add a phrase that you use actual data and or that comports with minimum criteria for relevant and valid scientific information. Minimum criteria for relevant and valid scientific information. You know, that is not tying the EPA's hands. That is simply saying, if we're going to do these studies, let's do them according to valid scientific principles using minimum criteria. Minimum. Now, my good friend, the chairman from Boston, is afraid of that. What that tells me is, apparently, our chairman doesn't want real science. We have a conclusion. We want to substantiate the conclusion. You don't want to use real science. I mean, if you really support the scientific principle and want to base the determinations of the Congress and the regulatory body on the facts, this should be in the bill. There's not, when my friend from San Antonio, with some justification, admittedly, accused us of sensationalizing the motions to recommit, this is the reason. You've got a straightforward, absolutely rock-solid, legitimate, substantial, within the spirit of the bill amendment, and it's being opposed. Not because there's anything wrong with it, because it might preclude some pseudoscience by some activist group that doesn't use minimum criteria from being substituted for the real science. If this subcommittee accepts any amendment from the minority today, it ought to be this one. I am appalled that there is opposition to this. I am absolutely appalled that we can't even agree to minimum criteria for relevant and valid science information. That's all this does, and it puts it into 3 or 4 different places in the bill. It doesn't say industry-based studies. It doesn't say, far-right agenda. It says minimum criteria for relevant and valid scientific. That's what the whole scientific principle of our country is based on. That's what the National Academy of Sciences is based on. That's what supposedly the Centers for Disease Control Studies are based on. The National Science Foundation is based on. Why we can't agree to this is beyond me. And I yield to my friend from Texas, Dr. Burgess.
Well, I thank the ranking member of the full committee for yielding, and actually he said it better and more forcefully than I could. It's pretty straightforward. We ask people to measure what they claim to have measured, to not be confounded by extraneous factors, and that it must be able to be replicated. That does not seem to be, to me, criteria that are developed by the industry, but it seems to me to be criteria that have been developed by scientists employing the scientific method over years and years of scientific study. Now look, this bill is being pushed through so quickly. There's actually plenty of time. If we've got legitimate difference about language, and I'm happy to have that discussion, but so far my staff has certainly been excluded for any of the discussions with the staff from the majority about the language, but I'm happy to work on this. The problem is this is going through quickly, but we all know it's a charade, it's a farce, it's a sham, because we have no budget. We're going to do no appropriations work this year because it's too dangerous in an election year, and as a consequence, this thing will languish until the next Congress. Why not take the time to get the language right? We were warned by one of our witnesses just a week ago that if you are not precise in your language, you're going to open the door to all sorts of problems, a host of unintended consequences, and then subsequent Congresses will be left having to clean up that mess. Let's take the time to get it right, accept the amendment today, or perhaps we can work on language in the future, but right now we're on this charging horse to get this thing done, and to be perfectly frank, Mr. Chairman, I don't even understand why. No budget, no appropriations, this thing's not going to see the light of day, the Senate's not going to pick it up, so why the rush? Why don't we take the time to do it and do it correctly? And I thank the Chairman for his indulgence. I'll yield back to the ranking member.
I ask for a yes vote on the Burgess amendment.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition? Chair sees none. The vote then comes on the Burgess amendment. All those in favor signify by the sign of aye. All those opposed, no. No.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a roll call vote.
The gentleman from Texas has requested a roll call. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Dingell. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin votes no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bonomack. Ms. Bonomack votes aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Barton.
Aye.
Mr. Barton votes aye.
Are there other members seeking to
Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, no. Mr. Ross. No. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeas were 17. The yeas were, I can't read my own hearing. On that vote, the yeas were 13 and the nays were 18.
Great. The amendment was defeated. Are there other members seeking recognition? The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5320 offered by Mr. Shimkus. On page 17, strike lines 1 through 7.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry. The gentleman from by unanimous consent, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Illinois is recognized to explain this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very short. I raised this in the Congressman Griffith's amendment. There's one provision in there that I just brought out and highlighted by itself, which was the language of the amendment is striking lines 1 through 7 on page 17. This deals with the $1 million each year from the Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Fund to pay for the EPA's own drinking water needs survey of states. If $14.7 billion authorization is not enough, I mean, if we had this debate of how much is too much in authorization and that we're not serious about reducing spending or at least reducing an authorization amount, why not at least $1 million per year that is going to go to the EPA to evaluate the water standards of states when it is local water facilities and state facilities that are addressing the needs and applying for the loans and grants to do their water to begin with. Out of $14.7 billion authorization, can we not cut the authorization down by $5 million? And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair recognizes himself in opposition. This amendment would strike funding to conduct EPA's needs survey. This survey documents the 20-year capital investment needs of public water systems that are eligible to participate in the state revolving fund program. The needs program is an essential undertaking for meeting the public's need for safe drinking water. Voluminous amounts of data are collected on each project listed on the survey questionnaire. Data collected includes master plans, capital improvement plans, sanitary survey reports, and other sources of project information. All this documentation must be reviewed by EPA to ensure that the project meets the criteria for the needs survey. The most recent needs survey was completed in 2007, and EPA found that our nation's drinking water systems require at least $334 billion in investment over the next 20 years. Any suggestions that this survey is fundamentally inaccurate fails to consider all of the other data that confirms their findings. Last year, the American Society of Civil Engineers gave our nation's drinking water infrastructure a grade of D-. An EPA assessment performed in 2002 predicted that by 2020, 44% of our drinking water pipe network will be classified as either poor or very poor or disturbingly life elapsed. In effect, this amendment says that our drinking water program can be solved by simply closing our eyes to the tremendous need we face. We need to do this assessment. We need to understand how big the problem is. I urge a no vote, and I yield back the balance of my time. Other members seeking recognition on the Shimkus amendment? The chair sees none. The vote then comes on the amendment. All those in favor signify by the sign of aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. The noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, record a vote, please.
The gentleman from Illinois requests a roll call. The clerk will call the roll. I believe that this is the last amendment that is going to be made, so we will move then to final passage. So the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, no. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill votes no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Dingell? Mr. Boucher? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone, no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Green? Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, no. Ms. Harmon? Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin votes no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Waxman? Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bonomack? Ms. Bonomack, aye. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Melanson votes No. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee votes no. Ms. Harmon? Ms. Harmon votes no. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Boucher? No.
Are there any other members seeking recognition to be recorded? The chair sees none. The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that amendment, the yeas were 11 and nays were 17.
The amendment was defeated. Does any other member seek recognition? If not, there being no further discussion, the question occurs on the manager's amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no.
No. No.
In the opinion of the chair,
roll call, Mr. Chairman.
There will be a roll call, which is called. There was a roll call. There was a request for a roll call to put the majority on record, and so the clerk will call the roll.
No.
This is a vote on the manager's amendment in the nature of a substitute
I withdraw.
as amended.
All right, I withdraw my request for a roll call. I want to have a roll call on final.
This is actually the vote on the manager's amendment in the nature of a substitute. If it passes, then there will be a vote on final passage. Is that not correct?
That is correct.
I withdraw my request for a roll call.
The chairman never called the vote on the, did the ayes have it or the noes have it?
I was going to say that the ayes had it, but the gentleman from Michigan asked for a recorded vote in the midst of my...
So your hearing is such that you thought the ayes had that?
I was listening. I was actually, to be honest with you, I was listening to the gentleman from Michigan request the recorded vote, and so I was going to grant that for the minority. But the gentleman from Texas has indicated, and I think now telepathically communicated it to the members on the minority side and orally to all of us, that he actually wants to vote on final passage. And I think if that is the case, then we can proceed to that point.
Well, first,
under 30 seconds.
But you did call. I'm just for the record. I'm technically challenged here, but I think the rules are the rules. How did you call the vote on the manager's amendment in the nature of a substitute?
I would say that the ayes had it.
All right.
And the ayes have it. And now let me see here. The manager's amendment is adopted, and I now move that the Subcommittee on Energy and Environment forward the legislation, the Assistance, Quality, and Affordability Act of 2010, as amended to the full committee with the recommendation that the bill pass. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I do request a roll call vote.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Markey?
Aye.
Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Doyle? Yes. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, aye. Ms. Melanson? Ms. Melanson votes aye. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill, aye. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, aye. Mr. McNerney? Ms. McNerney, aye. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Boucher? Mr. Boucher, aye. Mr. Pallone? Ms. Pallone? Aye. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Engel? Mr. Green? Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps votes aye. Ms. Harmon? Ms. Harmon votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez? Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes aye. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, aye. Mr. Waxman? Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton, no. Mr. Hall? Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns, no. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, no. Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Shattuck, no. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts, no. Ms. Bonomack? Ms. Bonomack, no. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, no. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith, no. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton, no. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Blunt votes no.
Seeking.
Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee votes aye.
Are there other members seeking recognition? Yes, the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Hall votes no.
Are there other members? Chair sees none. The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, final passage, the yeas were 18, the nays were 13.
The motion to favorably forward the bill to the full committee as amended is agreed to. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming corrections to the measures forwarded at today's markup without objection. So ordered. We thank all of the members for their attention to this extremely important piece of legislation. This hearing is now adjourned.